So this is another video. It's called Lightspeed constancy is ambiguous. So the information is coming from this person who's Harry Ricker. He's a dissident at the Chapel Natural Philosophy Society. A lot of things Einstein said are ambiguous. Harry Ricker collects together the different things Einstein said about lightspeed constancy, and it's just ambiguous. And the relevant paper is at that website address. Riker deals with other things in his article, but just going to deal in this video about the ambiguity of lightspeed constancy. Harry Ricker is part of the distance science, having looked at the mainstream physics and decided it is wrong. Harry Ricker says, given the ambiguity, obscurity and confusion in Einstein's papers on the special theory, it is not surprising that the second postulate was not one of the first points of controversy that arose from opposition to his theory. All of this was complicated by a lack of a clear and precise statement of that theory, which Einstein never gave. Einstein abandoned special relativity just as its formal content was becoming clearly defined. Einstein left it to the lesser prophets to work out the final details. By lesser prophets, he means the people who came after him. Thus, Einstein was creating a source of more confusion by allowing the lesser prophet to define the content of his theory through their often different interpretations. So what he's saying is the people who came after Einstein were interpreting things differently. Riker goes on to say, in the March 2006 issue of the American Journal of Physics, Ralph Balin summarizes the results of the controversy over the interpretation of the second postulate. He asks the following question: does the phrase the constancy of the speed of light have the same meaning today that it had when Einstein used it in 1905? And the surprising answer is a resounding no. Riker goes on to say, Einstein never gave clear and consistent definition of his principles. Here we will see that he gave different and consequently confusing definitions of his principle of light constancy in his many different publications. In his different papers, he gives the following definitions. First one, in 1905, he says, this is Einstein, light is always propagated in empty space with a definite velocity c, which is independent of the state of motion of the emitting body. And also in 1905, Einstein says, any ray of light moves in the stationary system of coordinates with a determined velocity c, whether the ray be emitted by a stationary or by a moving body. Then in 1907, Einstein says, we now assume that the clocks can be adjusted in such a way that the propagation velocity of every light ray in a vacuum measured by means of these clocks becomes everywhere equal to a universal constant c, provided that the coordinate system is not accelerated. And then in 1910, Einstein says a ray of light in vacuum always propagates with the same velocity c, which velocity is independent of the body that emits the ray. Then in 1912, Einstein says there exists a coordinate system with respect to which every light ray propagates with the velocity c. Riker then goes on to say all the other different things Einstein said about light speed constancy. In 1915, Einstein says every light ray in a vacuum always propagates, at least with respect to a certain coordinate system, k, with a definite velocity constant c. In 1917, Einstein goes on to say something else, and then in 1920, Einstein says something, and then so on. Einstein just keeps going on, giving all these different versions of what light speed constancy means. I'll give you a moment to read that. So moving on. When Harry Riker points out the interpretation of the light speed constant postulate by the lesser postulates, he says this section examines the question posed above: where did the commonly used definition of light postulate come from? Since it does not seem to be stated in the same way as in Einstein's fundamental papers, Pauli gives the following formal definition of the postulates in his influential book Theory of Relativity, which was published in 1921. And Pauli says the velocity of light is independent of the motion of the light source. And he goes on to say there is no question of a universal constancy of the velocity of light in vacuum, if only because it has the constant value c only in Galilean systems of reference. Harry Riker then goes on to say that Max Born, in another famous and highly influential book, which was called Einstein's Theory of Relativity, published in 1920, gives the following formal definition: in all inertial systems, the velocity of light has the same value when measured with rods and clocks of the same kind. This is essentially the same as Cadell's incorrect definition, but gives the added requirement implicit in Cadell's that the units of measure are identical in all of the inertial coordinate systems. Lee Page, in his book An Introduction to Electrodynamics in 1922, follows Einstein's later works in making the principle of relativity the primary postulate, with the principle of light constancy subsumed into it. The philosophers also took up relativity, and the following definition is given by Ernest Clausius in his book Einstein's Theory of Relativity, 1921. Light in an empty space is always propagated with a definite velocity v, and that's an old notation normally to use the letter c, independently of the body emitting it from whatever system one made the observation, and from whatever source the light issued, there will always be found the same determinate value for its velocity of propagation. This is nearly identical to Einstein's definition 3 given above from his 1910 paper, but he goes on to imply that the result is universal for all observers using the same units of measure. And then Harry Riker goes on to say, probably the most compelling reason to reject Einstein's light constancy postulate as a valid axiom of the theory is that there is no clear, unambiguous interpretation that can be assigned to it. This follows from the many different versions which Einstein himself gave, hence it must be invalid. Thank you, and that's the end of this video.